What's up, everybody? My name's Adam McDormand, and this is Medium Quality. It is almost impossible for me to go any length of time on this YouTube channel without making a video about progressive rock. It's like the sun and its gravity just pulls me in, and even if I burn to death, I am going to do so listening to progressive rock. I get that I might be a little bit younger than the average prog rock fan, so let me talk about how I got into prog rock, and then we're going to take a look at 5 records. For me, the journey to progressive rock started when I was about 13 years old. I got a bass guitar as an early 14th birthday present, and for some reason, one of my dad's co-workers heard about this and thought, oh, this kid needs to hear some great bass players. And this might have been the height of the mix CD era. This guy burned me a CD that included some of his favorite bass players, people like Geddy Lee, Chris Squire, Doug Pinnick from King's X, and a number of other guys. And one of the things that happened to kind of connect many of those bass players to one another was that they were all members of or adjacent to the prog rock genre. I was trying to learn how to play bass. These guys were clearly kind of the top of the heap in terms of skill, and they were doing interesting things with the music, at least on this burnt CD. And so I was primed. Then he just started sending me more and more stuff. This guy that I never met was sending music home to me by way of my father, and the rest is history. So in celebration of my love for progressive rock and my love of the albums that I have in my collection, I have pulled 2 albums that I think are just go-to standard prog rock albums. One that might be a little bit off the beaten path, one that's a little bit newer, and one that you might argue is not progressive rock at all. And I think we should have some fun. Now, obviously, no conversation about progressive rock can exclude one of the greatest progressive rock bands of all time, my favorite band of all time, Yes, and the classic album Close to the Edge. I have 3 copies of this album in my collection right now, and this is probably my favorite. This is the Mobile Fidelity Sound Lab master of this album, which was released in 1982. It has since gone out of print, and it's fairly hard to come by, but I managed to grab a copy. It wasn't exactly cheap, but since this is probably my favorite album of all time, it was totally worth it. I've listened to this album dozens and dozens and dozens of times, and it almost never gets old for me. Now, what's interesting about this album is the fact that it only has 3 songs. And within those 3 monstrous compositions, the album manages to go from, very soft, kind of pastoral, spacious arrangements to things that are a little more straight ahead rock and roll. And it does all of it very, very well. This is a great sounding album to begin with, and this is a really great mastering of this album. If you like Yes, if you like progressive rock, this is probably the album that you want to get. Now, I also have the Steven Wilson remix and remaster from the recent vinyl box set, and that's a really great listening copy as well, but this is for sure the one to listen to. Next up is another obvious choice when talking about progressive rock. This is Selling England by the Pound by Genesis. This is an album that when I first heard it, I did not get it. I did not like it. I was a Yes fan first, and for me, Genesis was like a distant, second or third. And even then, I was more interested in their pop stuff. But over time, this album grew on me, and I've come to really, really like it. This is an album that is open, it is spacious, it's sometimes rambling in its compositions, but there are these moments that are intense and really distinctly British. There's something about this album that for me sounds like such a product of its place, to the point that it took me repeated listens over the course of several years to really understand what's so great about this album and how it reflects the progressive rock genre and the sensibilities of that time. This is an album that you got to give it some time. You have to dedicate some thought to it, but it will pay dividends for you, I guarantee it. Next up, we have the weird one of the bunch. This is Gentle Giant's The Power and the Glory. Now, it's easy enough when talking about progressive rock just to go to bands like Yes and Genesis and King Crimson. But if you stop there, you'd be missing out on some really interesting acts that maybe weren't as radio friendly, but really did some interesting stuff. But Gentle Giant is just one of those bands that never permeated the public consciousness, at least as far as I know. I happen to think that The Power and the Glory is a great album. It does a really good job of balancing very listenable, very fun sections of music with songs that are more musically dense and more challenging. All the while, it kind of tells a story or puts forward a message about how one might become disillusioned with power as they gain power. And in that sense, it's kind of political or philosophical in its lyrical content. If you can take the time to enjoy the music and study the lyrics, I think there's something interesting here. And yes, it's off the beaten path a little bit, but many of the great treasures in this musical genre are going to require you to do a little bit of legwork on your own, to leave the comfort of your Close to the Edge, your Fragile, your Selling England by the Pound, your In the Court of the Crimson King, and find albums like this. Next up, we're going to jump to something quite a bit newer with Transatlantic's The Whirlwind. This might be one of the best classic style progressive rock albums to come out in the last 20 years or so. It takes the kind of sensibilities of progressive rock and pulls it into the modern era. And if anybody could do it, it'd be these guys. And that's because Transatlantic is a progressive rock supergroup consisting of Neil Morse from Spock's Beard, Roy Stolt from the Flower Kings, Pete Trewavas from Marillion, and of course the legendary Mike Portnoy from Dream Theater. The Whirlwind is essentially one 78-minute song that sprawls and spreads across this double LP and really has some amazing moments. This is kind of the definition of what progressive rock is, but brought into the modern era. And if you are a fan of the old progressive rock bands and you haven't heard this album or haven't heard anything by Transatlantic, this is really a great place to start. Now, the last album that I pulled off the shelf today is one of which we might ask, is this actually progressive rock? And that is Coheed and Cambria's Good Apollo, I'm Burning Star 4, Volume 1, From Fear Through the Eyes of Madness. What a mouthful. This is an album that I absolutely fell in love with when it came out in 2005 and managed to snag this copy on vinyl when it was somewhat recently reissued. One of the things that makes this album so interesting is the fact that it is essentially looking at punk music, at emo, through the lens of progressive rock. And viewed through that lens, they take on a very different shape than they might otherwise. This album has the long song lengths, the sprawling blues guitar solos, and presents it all in this concept album that actually spans the length of multiple albums. The concept is hard to follow. I never understood what any of it meant, regardless of how inexplicable it all is. It still manages to provide a narrative through line through all these songs that makes this album feel extremely cohesive, in spite of the fact that it is doing emo and punk through the lens of progressive rock and classic rock to some degree. If you are a fan of progressive rock and you've lived in the 1970s, it's time to step out of your house. It's time to check out albums like this that may be so progressive that they aren't progressive rock anymore. It's definitely worth a listen. It's very interesting. It's an album that's very nostalgic for me. And there you have it. A couple of obvious choices, a not so obvious one, something new, and something that may not actually be progressive rock at all. Guys, that's going to do it for this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure you give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more, make sure you hit the subscribe button. And if you're really wanting to support what I do occasionally on this channel, then there will be a link in the description section below where you can get some pretty cool medium quality merch. Until next time, guys, keep spinning that good stuff. What a time to be alive.